Hello there, and welcome to the Quantum Dragon podcast. My name is Brian Siegelwax, and I am the leader, pioneer, and expert in unprofessional podcasting. With me today is a man who needs no introduction, and it's one of my pet peeves when someone says someone doesn't need an introduction and then goes ahead and introduces that person anyway. But there's no way, and I mean no way, you don't know who Dr. Bob Sutor is. So I'm going to honor him by not introducing him and skipping ahead to my first question. So I have
Okay.
two early memories of you, which is to say 5 or 6 years ago, and I don't remember which happened first. So I'm just going to start with caffeine. I remember you using Earth as a reference that accurately simulating a single caffeine molecule would require a supercomputer with the mass of a non-trivial percentage of our planet. And yes,
Mhm.
you tell that analogy much better. But my question is, what's the origin of this analogy, and how did this analogy become one of your trademarks?
The origin was a spur of the moment decision with a colleague of mine immediately before we spoke to the IBM board of directors about quantum computing. We were chosen. She's a quantum scientist, and so we were chosen just to give them a 10-minute update. And we both felt the update was a little dry, kind of technical, didn't really convey much in the way of why this was important, this kind of exponential growth. And so, yeah, we were just kind of going back and forth, and we said, well, how about molecules, right? To perfectly represent the electronic aspect of a molecule inside a quantum computer, well, what would that take? And so we went back and forth and we picked some molecules and they were too big. And we didn't want one with a very technical name, even though caffeine does have a very, very long chemistry name. So caffeine, they know what caffeine is. Will that work? And so we went and I say she looked it up because she knows how to read a periodic table. And I just sort of know it has lots of numbers. And we figured out that actually caffeine was a great example. That you could represent this electronic structure. And here, literally, you're talking about electrons, right, in the caffeine molecule, with, I believe the number was 160 qubits. And then we worked out the math a little bit more, and we said, okay, so if we think of all the atoms that are in the earth, so just, look around, all the dirt, the mountains, everything, all the way in the entire, how many atoms are there? So what's the estimate for that, right? Because here we have caffeine on one hand, right? And then we have the earth, which people also know about. And we figured out that really you could that large a number, right, which is 2 to the 160, is somewhere between 1/10 and the number of atoms in the entire Earth. So the idea is that if you were to take classical memory and use 1 bit, right, for each of that information, you need the number of bits to correspond to, on the low side, 1/10 of all the atoms on the Earth, and on the high side, all of the atoms in the Earth. So this combination ended up just being a very good idea that the exponential quantum goodness was something that could really deal with problems that were far bigger than anybody could imagine. And then caffeine was great because, it was a board meeting and they all had their cups of coffee or tea or things. So I just used that. And again, it's a fairly global example of caffeine more than other things. Kept me out of trouble. Anyway.
Yeah, caffeine is great for many reasons. And speaking of caffeine, I'm
Hmm.
wondering if you have any coffee stories since you talk about caffeine so much. So, for example,
Hmm.
coffee is literally the foundation of my marriage. I
Okay.
once drank a coffee called Moac, mother of all coffees, that was so strong I was joking with people that I could see through walls. I also once drank a coffee that was accidentally made with seawater, which is the
Oh.
only coffee I do not recommend. So, how about you? Do you have any good or bad coffee stories?
Uh, not too crazy. Other than during the pandemic, when I really didn't want to go outside and go to grocery stores or anything like that, we started getting a coffee subscription. So it's ordered, and it's from Peet's Coffee, Peet, which is in the northwest of the U.S. And I sometimes get out of sync, and I suddenly realize I have 24 pounds of coffee, and I have to go back online and maybe slow down the schedule a little bit here. But that's about it. And in terms of marriage, yes, my wife points out, like, why do you have 24 pounds of coffee? You know, I think, well, I'm saving it just in case. It's the same reason why I have 12 different kinds of mustard. You gotta have some variety here and be prepared.
Yeah, I don't think we would question that. We would just start drinking it.
Yeah.
And my other early memory, so that was the first one. My other early memory is dancing with cubits.
Hmm.
And that stands out because I only remember one book in the beginning. Everyone was pointing to Mike and Ike, and that was it. I
Hmm.
do remember there was another book out there, but I don't remember which one it was. And I don't remember anyone making a big deal about it. But then Dancing with Cubits came out, and I should say this was probably on Twitter that I saw everyone making a big deal about it.
Yeah.
So, in the context of Mike and Ike already being out there, how and why did Dancing with Cubits come about?
Well, it really started because I had to learn quantum computing. Now, first of all, I had written a book before, way back around 1992. I worked in IBM research. It was my first long stretch there, and we developed what's called a symbolic computation system. So that is, you can deal with symbolic expressions, so polynomials and integrals and things like that, as opposed to being something pretty much strictly numeric, like you might find in a spreadsheet. Well, we had to write a book about that, and I did all the production on the book, and you could run it through the system and grab the answers, and I did all sorts of stuff. And so I'd been thinking about writing another book for a very long time. But when I was on the product side, in my role as an IBM executive, I sold many products and they were great for IBM, but they always seem to have very short lifetimes. You write about something and the audience is very narrow. Who cares about this product? Who cares about this version of the product, right? And so forth. So I just never really quite got around to it. But yes, back in 2016, IBM put a 5-qubit quantum computer on the web. I don't think we said cloud at the time. And through the serendipity of internal reorganizations, I reported to the same senior executive that the quantum team did. So I would be sitting in meetings with these quantum people, and they were very excited, and I didn't know what they were talking about. But I decided I should learn something about it, because it was fascinating. So I did look around, and at the time there were about half a dozen books, and there was a range of them. Some of them were a little older. A bunch of them were very mathematical in the sense of theorem proof, theorem proof, theorem proof, which I could handle. I have a PhD in mathematics, but most people don't really kind of want that. There are other books like Mike and Ike that really assume that you know a lot of physics, right? And several years worth of physics, and I did not. I mean, again, I have a PhD in theoretical mathematics, but my last physics class was in high school, and I learned things since. So, the short end is I didn't find a book that was for me, so I did what other people did. I learned a little bit here, or I learned a little bit there. I found a draft of a chapter that someone had written somewhere else. And I said, well, if I'm having this problem, maybe other people are having this problem. And so I should write a book that I would like to read. Now, the other factor of it too was quantum computing back then, and even right now, was getting a lot of attention. People wanted to learn more about it. On the physics side, it's based on quantum mechanics, which is one of the hardest part of physics, right? And strange, weird. That carries on to quantum computing, like the no cloning theorem. You can't copy information in quantum computing. So I decided that there was a big audience of people out there who either were willing to learn math or had learned math, high school or in university, right? But life went on and they did other things. But they'd love to learn about quantum computing. And you look at the prerequisites of probability, multidimensional linear algebra, complex numbers. How are they going to learn this? Are they going to take a course? Do they have to read a book on all these things? And how do they know they're going to have enough? So I wanted to write it in a way to be correct. And someone did ask me, are you going to write a book that's extremely popular, high level, and wrong? Or are you going to write a book that's technical and correct? And I said, well, I'm going to throw out the wrong part, but I want to be in the middle. So I wanted to write a book that was comfortable, that people would read it and feel I was standing right next to them, anticipating their questions and kind of filling in the gaps or asking questions for them to consider. I don't provide answers to the questions in the book, and my publisher didn't like that. But the reason is because I wanted people to think about it and go talk to people, go ask people, right? And if you're an instructor and you don't know the answer, well, that's on you. You have to learn enough of it. So that's where that book came about, and I think that's why it's been very popular. We published the second edition of March of this year. The first one was August of 2019. I do refer to it as the second and final edition. In total, the two books probably took 2,500 hours over 5.5 years, with a gap in between, but that's a lot of time. And that's a lot of focus and concentration. The title, by the way, and someone pointed out, it's the only quantum computing book that doesn't actually have the word quantum in the title. It is in the subtitle. The idea of that came about as I was giving a talk about how quantum algorithms work. And I described it as you have all these qubits and you're applying operations to them. And at some point, some qubits get entangled and they stay together for a little while, and then they separate, and other qubits get entangled. And so I just had this image of dancing qubits. So the dance of the qubits. So that's where the title comes from. Took a little, in the first edition, it's strange. It took people a little while to understand and it didn't always show up in searches. But by the second edition, that title, I feel, makes it stand out. People know it. It's not just another introduction to quantum computing with this, that, and whatever. It's got kind of a weird name, which I like.
Okay, so you just mentioned the origin of Dancing with Qubits. Then, speaking of the first edition of Dancing with Qubits, you came out a couple of years later with Dancing with Python.
Right.
So as someone who puts dragons everywhere, I can't help noticing a pattern. So I honestly don't remember where the dragon shtick came from, but do you remember uh well then you said you're gonna stop, but Dancing with Qubits and Dancing with Python, how did that become a theme from the original idea?
I had so Dancing with Qubits was a mathematical approach covering all the usual bases in quantum. Expanded a bit, and perhaps we can talk later about that. There are a couple of new chapters in the second edition. But I wanted to try an experiment, which was since there is so much, quantum computing is coding, right? And most of the systems with which you code for quantum computers are in Python. I thought, why don't I try to write a book that teaches both Python and the normal sorts of things, lists and strings and dictionaries and stuff like that, um, as well as a little bit of quantum computing. So to use Qiskit from IBM as the library in which to actually build and run quantum circuits. So Dancing with Qubits really has no code other than a couple little Python things, like, just computing some random numbers and things. But Dancing with Python is very code oriented. And, I like the book, but it really hasn't sold anything close to the Qubits book. And the problem is, it's a crowded market, right? There are a bunch of Python books, and there's a tremendous amount of Python material online, right? And now with Gen AI, right, you just go into one of them and say, write me some Python code that returns a list of this in sorted order and so forth and so forth. And at least you get a pretty good start. I think most of the Gen AI things are pretty terrible, but they are good at code. Um, and so Dancing with Python, not really a success. Went on, I wanted to have the dancing with. Came around to do the second edition of Dancing with Qubits, and I had originally thought I would do something for machine learning for the third book of the series, right? So quantum computing, Python, and then machine learning. At this point, though, I feel it would suffer the same fate as the Python book, right? Because you have to show real code. If it's just a whole lot of theorems and things like this and results and doing that, it's also an area that's changing so rapidly, right? The way people are refining transformer models and things like this. Um, and you have to ask yourself, if you're going to go to all the trouble of writing a book, you have to say, will anybody actually read this and how many? So if I'm going to take hundreds of hours to write a book, will more than 200 people actually read the book? If you hope to actually make any money, right? I mean, that can be a consideration. You don't have to, right? I mean, you can give books away, certainly, but if you're going to write the book, you somehow want people to read it. And so I'm at the point now where I think there are enough books out there about machine learning. Um, I think I think for both quantum and machine learning, there might be a market to go higher, more mainstream on this. That yes, there are books, of course, that talk about AI and quantum, but not necessarily the way I would explain them, right? And so, in that sense, the mass market, if you will, is much bigger than the people in the quantum bubble, right? Like by three orders of magnitude or four, right? So if I do anything else in that area, I'll probably go that direction, or maybe I'll just try writing a sci-fi book. We'll see. At this point, I don't feel I have anything to prove anymore about writing books. In the sense I've done some. So, if
I
I go the
agree.
effort, yeah.
I'll vote for a sci-fi book. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that's something I might try, but I have to actually see if I have an ear for dialogue and all that sorts of stuff and things like that. I have
Yeah,
some, I have some, I have some ideas. I have some ideas.
yeah,
So
I'm
we'll
probably
see.
the wrong person to ask about that. Um, but I'd now like to do some trigger word association. So not just word association, but trigger word association. The first one is Apollo program.
So how long an answer do you want to this, or is it
It's up to you.
Apollo program, extremely expensive, extremely complicated, thousands of companies and people getting involved, yet very successful from announcement to actually landing on the moon and coming back in about 8.5 years. Um, People like to talk about quantum moonshots. Getting to the moon was easier than evidently quantum is. We've been trying to get quantum computers to work well for much longer. So A moonshot is too easy a target for quantum computing, in my opinion.
All right, next up is hybrid.
I knew that would be on the list. I- I've been complaining about the term hybrid computing when people talk about classical and quantum computing together. If you were there at the beginning, you would see classical and quantum computers working together, right? And I feel that people tend to use it to say, like, oh, look at me, I'm doing something really special and different. I'm doing hybrid quantum computing, not just that plain old regular. And I don't think it's worth that. I think Shor's algorithm, which is very famous because of the cryptography type of thing. There are three major portions to that. There's a classical part, there's a quantum part, and there's a classical part. So, gosh, for only 29 years, we've been doing hybrid quantum, right? So, so I don't like the term. I also think hybrid's such a weak phrase. It doesn't imply any action. It just people use it for everything. Oh, a little of this and a little of that. At least use a word like integrated. Like that's we're doing something, we're making something and whatever. And even better, bring the whole thing up and talk about workflows. Talk about what's classical or HPC or what's AI or what's the quantum bit. Everything's not encapsulated into one little tight ball of classical and quantum. So real people know that it's workflows. It's not just algorithms.
All right, next up is septillion.
Septillion. Well, that evidently is a very large number. Google extrapolated on the back of an envelope, I think, that somehow a calculation done on their Willow chip, which was announced almost 2 weeks ago, that they could do in minutes somehow would take septillion years. I tend to think of it as quantum supremacy version 3, where you take an algorithm that might be interesting from a purely benchmark perspective. How quickly can we run? However, the algorithm has no practical uses whatsoever. And so you're saying, you can do this so fast, but basically for a useless problem, I don't care if I'm waiting 47 years or a septillion years. It's a useless problem. I wrote something last week and I compared it to, let's say in the biomedical field. And I came to you and I said, I have this incredible breakthrough. I can cure you of this horrible disease in only 1 second. Isn't that incredible? Right, I can cure you of this. Oh, by the way, it's impossible for you actually to get the disease. But let's forget that part. I can cure, it's like, wait a minute. The breakthrough is what? So, I think, first of all, the Google technical results were phenomenal. That's great. They're experts in building these superconducting computers and microwave engineering. Nobody questions that. It's just that the actual announcement was laden with all this extra stuff that was purely for the popular press, septillions and multiverses and things like this. So all kudos to them technically, but the PR was a distraction for those of us who have to correct misperceptions on the part of the public.
The next one is inspired by the poll that you've got running right now, or that poll might be nearing its conclusion,
Mhm.
but it's logical qubit.
So the phrase logical qubit, oversimplifying just for a moment, physical qubits are what you find in actual quantum computing hardware. So they can be superconducting qubits. They could be atoms with neutral charge like cesium or rubidium. They can be ions like barium. They can be a number of different things. And we're looking at the quantum properties of these things, often with photons and electrons, because they exhibit quantum mechanical problems. So we use quantum mechanical things to build quantum computers. That makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, sort of, the entire world around us is also driven by quantum mechanics at the small. So even though you're trying to do a computation on these qubits that you have either, borrowed because they're like atoms or things like this, or manufactured, the outside world keeps wanting to get involved. I mean, if you hit one of these things with a photon, it would destroy the computation. If you're not in a vacuum, right? All these other conditions, if there's a manufacturing defect and things like this. So physical qubits start to lose their values after a little while. You put some information in there and it slowly starts to go away. And you have a certain amount of time to operate when you can still tell what you had, right? You can still kind of get a glimmer of what you had. So there are ways of using software and multiple physical qubits to build what we call logical qubits, which in the first way last much longer, but also can participate in logical operations. So there are all these quantum operations which have weird names like X, Y, Z, and H and C naught and whatever. And you can do these things, and errors won't creep into that if you do it correctly. Okay, well, how much better than the physical qubits in terms of the errors do the logical ones have to be, right? If errors are creeping in, can you just tell that there was an error and then run the whole thing again? It's called post-selection. Or can you tell there was an error and then fix it? So this notion of logical qubits is being used across the industry in a very vague way. It's not they're not really saying enough about how much better they are, and they're not saying regarding this whole business of detecting or correcting errors. So my poll, which is about over, is to say, what should we call these so-called logical qubits that can detect but not actually correct? Should we call them half logical or semi-logical or quasi-logical? I'll give you a scoop. Quasi-logical is winning with semi-logical right behind it. And it's the idea of saying, yeah, it's better, but you're just detecting them. You're not actually fixing things like that. So just to give a little bit of distinction between the people who are doing correction, going that extra mile, kilometer, or those that are just saying, whoops, do it again. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just trying to, and I hope a friendly manner, trying to clean up some of the terminology.
All right. And notwithstanding, you're speaking with the global leader in unprofessional podcasting. The
Okay.
final word is leader.
Is leader.
Yes.
Way back around 1997, I became a manager at IBM for the very first time. And my manager, who was therefore a second line manager, we had a little talk. And he said, well, you officially have this job of manager. So you have people reporting to you, and you have to direct them a certain way to do, the math and then software stuff you're supposed to do. But you have HR responsibilities, and you need to nurture them and coach them and all these types of things. But you have to remember that regarding the actual topic that you're working on, and to get the people to work for you, you need to be a leader. And no one has to bless that for you. That is, you can become a leader without anyone saying, oh, Bob's in charge here, right? Is it because, you know stuff? Is it because you can motivate people, to get behind you and do things like this? So I think there's a very, first of all, a very careful distinction between leadership and management, right? You can be a very good manager, but not a technical leader. And you can be a technical leader and be absolutely horrible at management, as sometimes scientists find out when they do startups and they have to do HR and payroll and real estate and things like that. So I think primarily it's about leadership, and you have to choose what you do best if that's what you want to be. And oh, by the way, for individuals, it doesn't have to be a professional leader. Maybe it's a leader in your community or something else, right? But if you've got it in you, that's what you should try to get to.
And in your newsletter, I've seen you start highlighting how everyone is claiming to be a leader at this, that, or the other thing. So I'm now turning a virtual spotlight on you. And notwithstanding the state of the industry, did I just use notwithstanding twice? I need a bigger vocabulary.
Do they
But
cancel each
who do you identify as the actual leaders out there?
other? And also, just to be clear, I try to be very careful. And I never say to somebody, oh, you're saying you're a leader, but you're really not. Um, what we sometimes see, and remember, this is a lot of times social media, right? People get very excited about things and they want to tell the rest of the world. And sometimes it's safer just to publish a link to a press release or something, right? Because if you really don't know a subject and you say, and in my own words, of which I don't know too much about the subject, I'm going to simplify this for you, you can run into trouble. And people do that with quantum, they do that with AI, but imagine if they did it in the medical field. I know nothing about medicine or immunology, but in my own words, I'm going to explain to you in a simplified version. It's like, what? What? Why do you think you can somehow do that, right? So I think there are different classes of leaders in quantum. I mean, going with quantum, certainly there are many incredible academic leaders. It's hard to pick just one, though it is hard to avoid John Preskill as just incredible, right? In terms of really, truly understanding what all this means from the physics. Scott Aronson, of course, is widely admired. I admire him as well too. Because he fundamentally gets to the most important points. And I think that's critical. Somebody says they've done something amazing, and he'll analyze it and tell you. But I don't want to just really pick on those two. I think there are many startups who have some incredible people in them, right? Um, I admire the scientists who have done startups who are actively trying to become business leaders, right? To go back to our previous conversation, it's not sufficient just to be a scientist. You have to commit to actually being a good manager, executive, and leader to do these things. And I think there are quite a few examples of those as well. Um, I know I didn't give you too many names there, but we're in very good shape, let me say. Really, if I think about it across the industry, we're in excellent shape from a technology perspective. In terms of leadership, we do have another problem, which is I think quantum computing is stalling because we're not scaling the number of qubits nearly fast enough, right? But that's not your question here. So I think I think we're in very good shape. I think the next round of leaders, if I may say a little bit about what they will have to do, um, they're not going to be leaders for the first 10 meters of the job. Oh, I'm creating yet another type of qubit from something. Look at my 5 qubits, right? They're going to be the leaders that know how to bring together the different technologies to make something much bigger, right? You asked about Apollo before. When I give this example, it's the Gemini second stage. But let's put all the pieces together. What do we really have to figure out? Oh, we need quantum networking, for example, right? We have to do that. We need better control infrastructure. We need better codes. So the next generation of great leaders we will see will be the integrators of technology, right? Not just the starters of individual ones, but will be the integrators. And that will be interesting to see. I'm wondering who will step up. There are people absolutely at the IBMs, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Googles, right? The big name companies that are involved with this, NVIDIA, of course. But will they step up to push us past this roughly 1,000 qubit world we are to get to 100,000 and beyond and do it much faster? We're just taking far too long.
So the easiest way to follow what's going on is going to be to subscribe to your newsletter. And speaking of your newsletter, I find it's time consuming just to publish once per week. So I'm curious how you manage in your position and being in such high demand. How do you, and you alternate between quantum and AI too. How do you manage to publish daily?
Well, I don't actually publish daily. Um, it's interesting with LinkedIn. They ask you, will you publish daily or will you publish weekly? And I wanted to say, well, three times. How about that? I tend to do a ratio of two quantum to one AI. If you sort of look recently, my newsletters are shorter than yours, Brian. If you actually combine the words, if you were just to cut it up, your newsletters into two or three pieces, you too could have more and more frequently, right? Um, my newsletters are very particular in that I'm certainly for my job and for my interests. I have Google alerts. I look on LinkedIn and announcements. Other ways somehow find out what's going on. Yes, I read the Quantum Insider and other things like this. Sometimes I'm pre-briefed on some things. But fundamentally has to be, okay, this is innovative, this is significant, this is important. I care about this. I suspect other people might as well. Or sometimes, and you know this, you think it's funny, right? For all this heavy duty stuff, it's like, this is just amusing. I should share this, right? And things like that. So I break it down. I'm always playing with how I categorize this. I have I have 1,000 lines of Python code that I've written to do all sorts of things with these newsletters to generate them. I start with the links and I do web scraping and I do other things and I automatically add hyperlinks to it from JSON files. It's very interesting. So I try to automate as much as I can. And the thing that I only started doing about two-thirds of the way from when I started to now is starting to add commentary at the front. So that is, I don't just say, look at these links, which I did do at the beginning. I take a few paragraphs and comment on something. And they may refer to the links. There might be something that makes me think about it, or it just could be something extraneous that I say, hey, I want to talk about this now, right? It's a little bit easier for me to talk about quantum things than AI things. But there's always something by the time I'm ready. And the timing, incidentally, is a combination of the freshness of the news. If something really has to kind of get out there because people are talking about it, I try to I accumulate them as we go on. So every day I add a few links. And when I hit a seven or eight, I get it ready and out it goes. So it's a little bit irregular, you can't necessarily wake up every morning or every Wednesday morning and get it from me. But it's uh, it's my curated list when I feel I'm ready to say something about it. So
Yeah, thanks for the commentary, by the way, because that gives me content. It's very uh, enlightening and entertaining, which is kind of the whole purpose of what I'm doing. But I seem to be out of prepared questions. So, do you have anything else you'd like to add about? You mentioned the new chapters in Dancing with Qubits, or here's a free talking period.
okay, well, yeah. So just when I wrote the original book, which came out in 2019, I only had 500 or so pages. Printing has improved since then, and I was given about 700 pages for the second. So it's like, okay, I have more elbow room. Two topics I did not talk about in the first edition were NISQ algorithms, so typically variational algorithms, or quantum machine learning. And so those were the two chapters. I had tried to do something with NISQ in the first edition, but I couldn't figure out a way of doing it without really getting into the physics, Hamiltonians and all this sort of stuff. There's an assumption, I think, among many physicists that people in their everyday lives think about Hamiltonians all the time. In fact, it's a very specialized area. right? I had never heard of the Hamiltonian, right, until I was in my 60s. Just to give you an idea, I somehow managed to survive for over 6 decades, right? And things like this. And so I really, I tried for a month, in fact, when I was writing the first edition, to do something about NISC algorithms, and I couldn't get it right. So I was hoping they'd go away. I was hoping we'd have error correction before had to write a second edition or wanted to. And gosh, they didn't go away. And then, of course, with the rise, the increased importance of ML and things like this, and because they use variational algorithms under the covers for completeness, I wanted to say where we were on both. So those are the two new chapters, but I also went back and for those had to add a few extra sections. So there's a little bit of rearranging. There was one section I had to rewrite because I made a math mistake in the middle. And it's like people should get the second edition. Yeah. But honestly, in figuring out my math mistake, I discovered something that was really very, very interesting that I had never seen written down anywhere. And this goes right back to one of the reasons why I wrote the first book was I was so sick and tired of people saying, as is well known, and then you could never find anybody who actually says that, right? Which means they think it's true. They're pretty sure, but they don't have a reference for it. So I was trying to fill those things. And so in doing this, my misunderstanding led to like, oh, that's why that works. Phase estimations, it turns out. That's why that works. There's this symmetry in the middle of it that I had never seen anybody talk about. And when I mentioned it, it's like, oh yeah, everybody knows that. Yeah. Well, who told you? Because nobody ever wrote it down. Right. So anyway, it was an interesting learning experience. The other thing I want to say is I'm certainly not doing a 2024 top hits or, best results. There are way too many of them to talk about. I'm actually just really just to get on with 2025. Um, I think um, I think we've set ourselves up in a little way. I do try to warn people, marketing people, comms people, other people. Congratulations on all your December announcements. It's when we're recording this, it's December 22nd. All right. So in 10 days, all that December news will be last year's news. Last year's news. Remember last year when they announced that? Well, it could have been in January, it could have been December. It's all old news. So everybody has to get on. So I'm much more excited at this point of looking forward than I am of just recapping what we did. Others are doing that. That's fine. Kudos to them. But that's not where I'm going to spend my time.
Now, I listen to everything you say, but quote, gosh, they didn't go away, unquote. That was poetry. So thank you very much for being my guest. And this goes back a few years, but you are the first person in quantum who responded to one of my messages that caused me to show my wife your message and say, I can't believe this guy actually responded to me. True story. So this has been a real honor for me, and I'd like to thank you again. And I'd like to thank everyone who's still listening. And of course, feel free to stick around for the outro music, which is called Dungeons and Dragons. Enjoy.